Today, property dispatches from the front line. I caught up with Chris Curtis and we discussed the state of the property market in and around Sydney.
Hello, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. I'm with Chris Curtis here today. We're going to discuss the Sydney property market. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Martin.
Tell me a little bit about why we're having this conversation and how you got into property.
Right. Well, property's been a passion for about 30 odd years. I've been doing it professionally now for over 15 years, 11 years as a buyer's agent, as a principal of Curtis Associates Buyers Agents in Sydney, and we operate in the metropolitan area, south of the northern beaches down south, Sutherland Shire to the north, and then west of sort of Parramatta, Penrith Way. I'm a former investment banker, former barrister, and I'm also a member of the AAPI, or API, as a AAPI, so I'm a certified property practitioner there. Property, I suppose, after the law became the passion, and I decided over a decade ago to pursue it as a professional advisor. And during the course of that, I've had the good fortune to be able to do lots of research and publish lots of papers, and I'm always in the hunt for reliable data-based, granular, micro measures and so forth, and in that respect DFA fits the bill absolutely perfectly. So I've been following very closely your blogs over the years.
Right.
And then to the point where I thought I should reach out and make contact.
So let's just explain what a buyer's agent is, because some people may not be familiar with the role.
Sure.
So what do you do?
We act exclusively for buyers, so we never, a lot of people are very familiar with real estate agents. Technically, to do this job you have to be a real estate agent, but most people associate real estate agents with the selling side of things, whereas we're, and several of my colleagues are a growing band of people who act only for the buyer and in the transaction, and try and level the playing field for buyers, as opposed to this do-it-yourself model, which has predominated in Sydney for many years. And I think is one of the reasons why we have quite the high prices that we do. If you have one side of the transaction always represented by a professional negotiator and an amateur on the other side, it is only a matter of time where the amateur will come second to the professional. So we act for the buyer, that's all we do. Predominantly top higher end residential, and that sometimes defies analysis, but I think a good figure in this day and age is about $2 million plus. Our sweet spot is about, for residential, an average sort of figure that recurs over the years is about 2.5 million upwards. So in that respect, we're quite, we neatly fall into your categories 1, 7 and 8, if I can put it that way, and you know better than me what they are. You might like to explain what they are.
We'll talk about the segmentation shortly. So basically a buyer's agent is somebody who helps somebody looking for property to find the property and then negotiate for them and effectively help to get a better outcome as a result.
That's right. There's three key stages in the full suite of services. Firstly, the finding of the property, and there the key value proposition is finding things that are off market or pre-market, so that actually haven't hit the market. The second phase is rigorous due diligence, and we pride ourselves on doing that. And the third is in the acquisition phase. Most of those acquisitions will occur in private treaty context. Some of them will occur on an auction situation. Wherever possible, we try to avoid an auction because it's easier to control a private treaty negotiation than it is an auction situation.
So you've been at the game for quite a few years, and I was reading the CoreLogic research the other day, which said that prices at the top end of the market look to be moving down quite smartly in and around Sydney. So are you seeing any of that in terms of the momentum in the market that you're touching?
Most definitely. I mean, the higher they are, the harder they fall. That historically has always been the case, certainly after post-GFC. With our clients, I take a similar sort of attitude to you, Martin, in terms of granularity. We're very careful to say macro factors are a consideration, but be careful with metrics like auction clearance rates, median prices and so forth, because they're not necessarily reliable guides to what's happening on the ground at the coalface on a day-to-day basis. So in the final analysis, we much prefer to look at a micro based approach to it. Each property is quite different. You can have a different side of the market on one side of the street compared to the other, depending on orientation, topography, and that sort of thing. So that preamble is to say, yes, at the micro level, there are examples, several more examples in the current climate, certainly post Royal Commission and post the macroprudential changes that have occurred progressively since 2014. There is a marked macro correction generally happening at the top end of the market, but within that, at the micro level, if it's a good A+ property, there will be buyers for it, but you won't get typically the stellar sort of returns, or there's the odd exception in every case, but in the main, whereas before, in boom times, before those sort of factors, you'd have half a dozen people vying for a property, and they would bid that property up. Now you'll have fewer people bidding for that, and the result will be more on par with comparable sales evidence than historically.
So what does that mean in terms of movements in prices? I mean, I've seen some reports suggesting that the top end prices are down 15 to 20%. Is that what you're seeing? Or
yes, look, again, if it's not top shelf, it will be punished in this market, and I see more of that coming in the next year or two as these sort of systems work their way through the system, and I think the recommendations of the Royal Commission are going to be a profound moment in the Sydney property market, and one of the 4 reasons we think this time, this correction, bear in mind everything moves in cycles, but this correction is probably going to be different to ones we've seen in the past. So if it's not top shelf, even if it's at a prestige end of the market, it will get penalised, and 5 to 10% reduction, say over a 2-year period, it would not be uncommon.
So are you seeing people who are trying to sell property currently still expecting to get the same as they did a year ago, or is there some realisation that things have changed?
Yeah, so what we're finding now, we're right in the midst of that sort of vendor resistance where there's a sense of disbelief. As a general rule, people are quite slow to sort of react to the inevitable, and it takes time to meet the market. So we've gone through a phase, and I think at this level, working as we do in this phase, we've gone through that phase, and we're now at a situation where vendors are increasingly meeting the market, and that means reducing the price. It will always depend on the individual circumstances. So if you say, well, somebody could have bought elsewhere, they could be stretched financially, they could have a tax bill, there could be a change in circumstances that isn't widely known, they'll be more motivated to sell, and that's one thing we're noticing significantly at the moment is just a plethora of must sell, highly motivated vendor, has to be sold soon, etc. So yes, it's definitely moving towards a phase where correction will be more sustained than it has been in the past, where simply they've just taken the properties off the market, and that sort of reflects in some of the statistics. Some research houses will talk about an increase in listings, but that's a very mercurial topic as far as we're concerned, because nobody really defines listings too well. Listings might be up, but then if you drill down into that, you find some of them are old listings recycled, and the number of new listings are relatively sparse. So you get people who say, well, this wasn't the right time to sell, and they'll bring the property back to the market in the hope of doing better, but in the current climate, they're probably going to do worse than they would have done the first time around.
And what about the difference between auction sales rather than private sales? Are you seeing any difference in terms of the mix between the two?
Just fewer number of people coming through the door for auctions, fewer number of bidders. People would register as opportunists in New South Wales. And I should actually make clear here too that we're in all of this talking about the residential market. We also do act in the commercial and the industrial space, where the experience is quite different in Sydney at the moment to the residential, and particularly the top end residential. But at auction, it's the same sort of thing. Fewer number of registrants, fewer number of actual bidders, and presumably fewer number of people coming through the door to inspect these properties, because these, by definition, are on the open market.
So you said that there were a number of factors that were perhaps impacting this, and you touched on the Royal Commission, and presumably there we're talking about the tighter lending. But what are the other factors that you're seeing that explain some of the changes that you've seen in recent times?
We think there are four very significant and sometimes underappreciated factors. One is the Royal Commission. We predicted that would be a profound turning point several months ago, and it's in fact beaten even our expectations and many others. We think the big game changer that's occurring at the coalface for the informed buyer are the infrastructure projects that are going on in Sydney. I don't think there's any secret of the fact that we're no great fan of toll roads. We don't believe that it's good for property values in the longer term to have traffic being brought into the city. In that respect, we're one of the retrograde countries in the world where a lot of countries are taking their tollways out and we're putting them in with questionable business cases. Our concern there is that those projects themselves, except for the public transport, metro type projects, and I'm not even including in that the light rail project from southeastern Sydney, because there's real question marks about the viability and the use and the utility of that. But generally, there's more downside risk, as we said, in these infrastructure projects because mostly they're toll roads. And that brings with it the ventilation stacks, and that's highly controversial. I think that those projects per se are radically changing the whole landscape in the Sydney property market in a way that we've never seen before, and it extends right to the outer west. And if they do, for example, do the F6 connection through the national park, heavens forbid, it'll extend all the way down here to Thurl and the Illawarra and that sort of thing.
And that's just because of the ventilation?
Oh, not just the ventilation stack, but the actual toll roads themselves.
So what's it's basically buying up property, it's putting ventilation stacks in, all those factors together, right?
Yeah. It's the infrastructure that goes with them and the engineering that goes with them and the impact. You can suddenly have homes that are otherwise in very attractive positions with relatively clear air at risk of unfiltered exhaust from these tunnels being spewed into their area. And then the actual infrastructure themselves. So if you look at West Connects, I mean, the impact, for example, on a prestigious suburb like Haberfield is quite extraordinary. So we think these projects are a source of extreme risk. They're more of a risk than an opportunity for certainly those $1.5 million plus type properties, and the higher you go, the greater the risk in terms of value. The other factor related to that is the state government, which of course is driving this particular infrastructure boom. Unfortunately, we don't think that mix is right, and we think that mix should far more be skewed towards public transport than otherwise. But the preoccupation is still with these toll roads. The real concern here is in March, of course, we're facing a New South Wales state election, and if the current government is removed and Labor comes in, we've got a possible situation here where certain projects will be half completed and left that way. Nobody seems to be appreciating the risk that a change of government at the New South Wales state level in a matter of months, if that were to happen, could represent. So already Luke Foley is on public record saying that, for example, he won't build the beaches link that's proposed. He hasn't said that he won't build the Western Harbour Tunnel, which goes from Rozelle to the Lower North Shore. But he's also on record as saying that he would scrap that stage of the metro project to Bankstown. Presumably that's from Waterloo to Bankstown. Now, that covers quite attractive territory, and particularly territory that's appealing to inner west buyers in suburbs like Hurlston Park, Dulwich Hill and Marrickville, which is a big topic for a lot of these sort of inner west buyers. What happens along that line, whatever it is going to have a major impact, and is already having a major impact. We consider that, according to core logic, the typical life cycle of a before somebody buys a second time is 11.2 years. The folklore has had it as about 7 years. We think we think that the statistic must be right, but it is not uncommon to see people trading their properties over a 7-year cycle. So when you consider the scale of these infrastructure projects, it's conceivable that you could be buying in an area where this infrastructure is being built, never to enjoy that infrastructure and before you sell again, because these things will span through the construction phase and so forth at least 6 or 7 years. So when we alert buyers to that sort of temporal reality, it can have a very sobering effect and cause people to say, I hadn't appreciated that, or I didn't realise that there was going to be 4 stacks potentially in Rozelle and I'm a Balmain buyer, or I'm a Birch Grove buyer, or Rozelle buyer, or Lilyfield buyer. I didn't realise. And then when you go and point out to them that the international studies suggest that a distance of about 1.2 kilometres from these stacks is potentially dangerous, then you realise that knocks out Annandale. If you're concerned about that, if you, for example, the typical concern of those raising young families with young lungs exposed to this sort of thing, and they go for a villagey type suburb as it's perceived for Annandale or even Glebe, and then suddenly when you show these potential buyers what's planned, what's proposed in terms of traffic flow and air quality, and not only going to have one of these things but 4 in close proximity to each other, the buying decision can be quite different. And if that then becomes a generalised trend, it's easy to see how that infrastructure can act to suppress prices in those particular areas. What we find is a profound sense of ignorance about these things. These are complex and they're almost designing these things on the run. A lot of people are quite unaware of just the risks that they're running, and when you point that out to them, it can suddenly rule us up about, and we're finding that.
So we've talked about the Royal Commission, we've talked about infrastructures. What are the other two?
Well, a change of government, which I think is closely
Okay.
related to.
Yep.
And then the other one, which is the sleeper issue, I think is a potential exodus of international students.
Mm-hmm.
We don't, as a general rule, we don't, as a matter of course, buy generic product, the sort of mass-produced boxes in the sky. We, seriously counsel our buyers, if they want us to buy that, of course we will buy that, but as a general rule we don't, because people, we encourage people to look for something a bit more special, in smaller blocks and that sort of thing if you're a unit buyer. But the reality is that these sorts of projects have really, these big inner city projects around the university campuses and so forth, have themselves propped up a lot of the Sydney property market. And what is actually happening, and it's documented everywhere, and I think you've picked up this point too, is that the Chinese universities and so forth, the number of visas, the changes that were made to the 457 visa, and plus all the stamp duty, the punitive stamp duty for foreign buyers and everything. These are all forces that are conspiring to make Sydney less attractive to the tertiary educated international student. And we think, like any pack of cards, that even though that might not be an area that we're too directly involved with, we're watching it very carefully, because if you take one of the cards out of that particular part of the deck, and suddenly demand really collapses because, for example, the Chinese universities, or China says, look, or India and or Indonesia, look, we don't need to send our kids over there, and therefore we don't need to buy a property over there. That could really operate in a micro market of the Sydney property market to suppress prices and produce a shock through that local domestic system. So that's the fourth big. I mean, there are other factors at play, but we nominate those because jointly and severally we think that they represent a unique conjuncture. They're all occurring at the same time, and I know that universities they're probably not openly saying this, but I have it on good authority that they are quite concerned about their diminishing popularity. And I noticed, the rankings that came out this week, the Fin Review talked about the good side of the rankings, whereas the other masthead, the same masthead, a different paper, talked about the bad sides of it. And in fact, in 2 key metrics, Australian universities are performing quite poorly. They're the sort of metrics that the Chinese consumer of that export, which is really our third biggest export nationally, are looking at very carefully. And if they start to form a dim view, they won't send the people here, and the consequences will flow through to the property market. So we think those 4 things happening in concert are things to be watched.
Given that backcloth, what we're seeing more broadly around the traps, what are you saying to your prospective clients as they come to you and say, I'm thinking of buying in Sydney?
Great question. Our particular model, and it should be the model that all buyers agents follows, is firstly to be the advisor before you're the acquirer. So it's a fiduciary obligation in the ultimate analysis. So if it's not right for the buyer in the longer term, we see it as our duty to say, well, we might be doing ourselves out of an acquisition and therefore a fee, but we really don't think this is in your best interest. So yes, a correcting market like this, as the old analogy goes, when is it time to catch a falling knife? There's no doubt that the market is correcting. As I say, it's not completely across the board. Good quality stuff is still holding its price, but it's not going through the roof. And that applies at all price points. That's the market that we're in now, so it is very, very challenging. You're not a gun for hire. In our view, you shouldn't be a gun for hire. And the NCD question is, in very many cases, we're saying to people, think very carefully about doing it, or maybe now is not the right time. So I'll give you an example. A smaller matter that is, they're very, very keen to sign us up, and we found out that their choices are very limited because the budget is quite keen, but it's not impossible, particularly in a correcting market. So their expectations relative to budget, which is an essential criterion that we look at, are realistic. However, when you get wind of the fact that these particular people to make the acquisition they're talking about will be geared to about 90% relative to the asset that they're looking to acquire, which will be a secondary asset at that level in an outer suburb, our advice in writing is, frankly, we don't recommend you do it, because the chances of that particular type of asset, that's at a high risk of losing value over the short to medium term. Therefore, now that you've shared with us your level of gearing, the chances of you being in negative equity are almost certain. So, the best view is to save as much as you can or make other arrangements, but on the here and now, we would not feel comfortable acting for and recommend you don't buy. It was alarming to get the response back, having been through all of the processes of getting the finance. What we find is increasingly, people, the only people that typically, given that there has been an exodus really of the foreign buyers, particularly with restrictions that have come in China and so forth, at the high end, there's far fewer of those around than there were in the past. Those that are buying at the top end, a large percentage of them will be the downsizers, the aging baby boomer, who may have just cashed out at the right time by selling something large further out of Sydney, typically on northern beaches or upper North Shore, that sort of thing, and then have a stack of cash that they can come closer into the city and buy something more compact and start to enjoy the benefits that CBD living provides. And there's an army of those, and so there's strength in that part of the market. That's a classic example, and that's where that's manifesting itself is in some of these CBD developments, these high-end CBD developments that are coming out of the ground, where the old law school, for example, was in Phillip Street. Those dotted around Hyde Park, Barangaroo to a lesser extent, and around this key precinct, they're selling extremely strongly on the lower North Shore, and it's very much catering not so much to the overseas buyer but to the local grey-haired baby boomer who's cashed up.
So one of the pieces of research that we've done is what's called the bank of mum and dad. In other words, money comes out from the parents and goes across to the kids to allow them to buy. Yeah. Are you seeing any of that in your work?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. More, of course, with the younger buyers, so more your category one or and you might define that, but as I understand it, that's the group of well-educated aspirant people who tend to orientate closer to the city and in sort of professional existences and have been used to a fairly decent sort of lifestyle. If they go into the property market, typically they're about the sub 2 million mark, maybe a little bit over that, so 2.2 from 1.5, 1.6 to 2.2, very much candidates for the bank of mum and dad. And again, it's difficult to know, again, talking anecdotally, each person's circumstances differ, but these are fairly substantial contributions that we've experienced.
So we see them, we call them the young affluents, right?
Yeah.
Because they're basically people who have relatively large incomes, right?
Yes.
And the ability to therefore spend quite a lot of money.
Yes.
But they're the ones with the highest loan to value ratios and the highest loan to income ratios. And they're the most exposed across all of our segments.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are in and around that Sydney area.
Yeah.
So we're quite concerned about that sort of formulation, and particularly when the parents have given quite large sums of money across.
Yeah.
Those parents are relying on their value not dropping.
That's right.
So effectively that's an intergenerational problem here, which could actually turn nasty for both sets of...
It could, and look, that class of buyer is very much a large part of our sort of clientele, together with the sort of downsizers and things, but those aspirant, university-educated young affluents that have a certain expectation of lifestyle are very much a core. That is the class of buyer that sees value in services of the type that we provide. And I think you're right to identify them as a very high at-risk group or cohort of buyers, and you've got to tread carefully as these economic factors change.
Well, it's interesting because the two most at-risk groups, they're not the suburban mainstreams or even the urban fringe guys. I mean, they all have their problems, right?
Yes.
But it's actually the young affluents and then what we call the professional exclusive, so they're really the top end of the market.
That's
Right?
right.
And those guys, again, have massive exposure, multiple properties, cross-leveraged,
Yes.
and the income is not supporting it. And of course, if interest rates rise, which is the other factor in all of this, which probably needs to be thought about,
Yeah.
they're the ones that are really going to catch a cold first.
Indeed. And again, if you combine those two groups, you're here talking about the core of our business. And so, yes, we watch it very, very carefully. And as I said, we haven't really talked about interest rate movements and what their tolerance or ability to withstand changes are. But I would not be surprised, having seen a few spreadsheets in my time and how these acquisitions are sometimes funded, this is close to the wind stuff. And if the situation has improved rapidly, then you'd think that there isn't a great tolerance to accommodate a big interest rate rise.
Well, we run sensitivities on, so we know their income, we know their expenditure, we know their current interest rates. So we can actually run sensitivities on what would happen if rates went up 0.5%, 1%, 2%, 3%.
Yeah.
And it's very significant that it's the young affluents and those exclusive groups that are some of the most leveraged and exposed, even to a 0.5% or 1% interest rate rise. So
Indeed.
they are definitely leveraged up to the hilt
Mm.
and now exposed if rates rise.
And if you stand back from it, there's nothing particularly remarkable about that those two groups occupying a fairly dominant position in the market for prestige or for real estate in Sydney. Sydney is an expensive town, and therefore things don't trade otherwise than at a fairly high price. It's high by international standards generally, not across the board. So it's hardly surprising that the buyer cohorts reflect those sensibilities, and they are a group to look at very carefully, I think, and watch closely.
And my theory is that lenders have been quite tight in some areas, right, particularly the suburban fringe and the battlers, but they've been really, really free lending to these larger, more affluent household groups, assuming that the risk profiles are very, very okay. But in fact, my modelling suggests that those risk profiles are significantly worse than many of the lenders actually see.
That's right, and I think if the LTI, which is rapidly, 3 years ago, I think both you and I were writing along the lines where we're about one of the only countries that really paid faint regard to that as a learning criterion, and here we are 3 years down the track, and it's the topic on everyone's lips. And I'm quite sure that some of the people that bought 3 years ago were not thinking that they might be subject to ongoing monitoring as to their serviceability using no base case things but actual expenditure. And I see Triggerboff coming out the other day saying it's absurd to talk about that people just rein in their discretionary spend and afford their mortgage. I don't think it's quite that simple by the time you've got your childcare and by the time you've got your private school fees. These are major structural lifestyle changes that I think the young affluents and the aspirational classes would be very reluctant to make. So I can see stress in the middle.
Well, I'd say that some of them have already done that, right? They've already hunkered down, they've already put more on credit cards, so they've already taken that first phase. And in fact, what's interesting to me is that some of these households have got investment properties as well,
Yes.
and they're being forced to sell those investment properties to make ends meet, believe it or not.
Yeah.
So there is forced sales amongst some of the property investors at that top end as well.
And particularly some of those were in interest-only arrangements that expire, so in 2 years' time. And I think you've written things on this as well about 2019, 2020. So if you look at that period where APRA's macroprudential tinkerings occurred, in that last quarter of 2015, the impact that small, relatively speaking, change had on the system was immense. We can recall that was a boom period, and then it's as if you woke up one morning and said, which is what happened, the tide went out. And this was unheard of. You had young real estate agents used only to boom times, suddenly having to earn the money and sell. And that was a wonderful buying time for us, because the fear was in the marketplace. And if you had, as we do, good buyers who stayed the course, by April 2016, when the RBA foolishly dropped interest rates in a knee-jerk reaction by 0.25% of the official cash rate, off went the market again in the sustained boom of 2016. So those people who took a counter-cyclical position in the last quarter of 2015 in response to a short, sharp shock, as they thought it was, did extremely well and will still be sitting on a healthy on-paper capital gain. What we've now got, however, is a sustained program that's getting the screws getting tighter and tighter. And that's so we already see how profound these screws can be, if October 2015 was any indication. So I see pain down the track, and those interest-only loans are where that pain's going to manifest first of all.
My theory is it's different this time.
There's great nervousness, and this is what we're finding now amongst the valuation industry. So valuers are doing things that I haven't seen happen since immediate post-GFC, and it's beginning to happen with more frequency. When a market destabilises, as this is, you find valuers become very twitchy. And they won't, for example, place as much weight on the actual price that was paid, even if that price was achieved at a publicly conducted auction. It is now becoming not uncommon, but it's difficult to say because this is only anecdotal, but it is the case that some valuers are saying, regardless of what was paid at auction, we're only going to put this amount on it. And that can lead to an equity shortfall and the need for that baby boomer, for example, to put a second mortgage on another property to make up the shortfall. That sort of thing, valuer nervousness is symptomatic of a rapidly correcting market.
So it's interesting because I've had a number of people tell me, anecdotally, through the blog and through the website, of situations where they got a valuation with the bank when they started the process to get a mortgage. But when they actually came to close the deal, the bank insisted on another valuation, and it was sort of down 15, 20%, and then they were stuck because effectively on one side of the fence they sort of said, well, you said that we could get this, and yet now the valuations are coming in much lower.
Yep.
So that sort of tricky situation appears to me to be quite prevalent now in the market here.
Yeah, it is. It's again another sort of anecdote. These sort of things, and you and I both have a real thirst for data as opposed to anecdote, and getting that sort of granularity is very, very, very difficult. So you, by force of circumstance, have to look at the anecdotes, and I have heard tales like that, and we've responded, for example, by alerting potential and actual clients to that sort of phenomenon, and so that you now have to engage in dialogue with your financier during the course of the search. The search, typically we allow a maximum of 4 months, but our current strike rate is about 20 odd days from sign up to acquisition. During that period, we remind them that you have to keep your finance current, and that is now becoming increasingly difficult. So your pre-approval, particularly if it was something obtained towards the expiration of the pre-approval, is something that you really need to revisit and make sure you're still good for the money when it comes to time to settle. So that is a concern, and I know the valuation industry is challenged on or profession is being a certified property practitioner of the API, so that is the body that registers the valuers and so forth. We obviously attend a lot of seminars and that sort of thing, and come into contact on a very frequent basis with valuers in that context. And there are a lot of challenges facing the valuation industry, the profession that they're now really wrestling with. The cladding, for example, on some of these buildings, that's a bit of a sleeper issue. Massive potential impost for individual owners if that cladding has to be removed. That's a work in progress. There's talk of some 1,800 blocks in New South Wales that might need this sort of remediation at various expenses. That's causing angst amongst the valuation profession, as indeed is contamination issues and wrestling with that. So it's very much, these are very challenging and new topics for valuers, and this is all coming at a time when there's a fairly sharp correction occurring in the most populous of property markets in Sydney. So interesting times ahead.
And the tricky thing about valuations is on the sliding market, it's actually much harder to pick the value than on a sort of steady or rising market, right?
Yeah.
And even some of the indices that are out there don't work as well when things are going down compared with when they're going up. So in fact, my argument is that some of the valuations that are being spruiked at the moment could well be wrong, because nobody really quite knows where true value currently is and where it's heading.
Indeed, and there are other things too that I think are probably creeping into the analysis, and that is we've all read about the blacklisted suburbs for the fear of oversupply of higher density buildings coming on stream, and there's no doubt that that's another factor that's going to have an impact on the Sydney property market, possibly soaked up a little bit by the population tap, which is left on full throttle, and that's a different topic again for another day. But I rather suspect that one of the reasons, particularly with more homogeneous product, you've got like units and that sort of thing. I think these blacklists may be influencing valuers to some extent too, to say rather than look at the individual transaction or even comparable sales, we'll look at those, but perhaps only look at the most conservative of those, sometimes even ignore those in the building and look at an inferior building down the street and use that as your baseline, and then possibly then already got an ultra-conservative valuation, and then test that by saying, is this building in one of the blacklisted postcodes? And even if the building itself isn't one of the blacklisted buildings, or it might be a high quality sort of development, the fact that it finds itself in an area where there's perceived to be a potential oversupply of lesser quality stock, I wouldn't be surprised if that sees a further conservative re-rating of the valuation, leading the mortgagor into a situation of a shortfall. So, if valuers and purchasers get out of step, that in itself is a separate and distinct source of potential shock, because that is your quintessential credit crunch. If you simply, and that is what we're at the beginning of. I have very little doubt that there's been a period of excess lending over the last, I'd say, half decade. I think lending standards, relatively speaking, are now being exposed to have been quite slack and quite lax. I think money's been too easy to get in a low interest rate environment. As with any binge, there's going to be a hangover, and that hangover is going to translate into a credit crunch, and I think that credit crunch is just starting. Part of that credit crunch will then be the valuation profession reacting in a defensive way, and that will, if it's not treated carefully, will only exacerbate the impact of a credit crunch. So challenging times.
So what's your sense then, if you look ahead over the next 12 to 18 months? I mean, my own view is that we could see prices down 20 to 25% over that period. Is that ballpark that you'd see?
Of your four scenarios, I think, like you, that 2 and 3 are the more likely. And I think every day that trundles by with this Royal Commission, and then what's happening with the NZ cartel case and so forth, and the change that reflects in the regulatory mind, there's an overreaction occurring amongst the APRA, the four main bodies, including ACCC, that's getting itself dragged into banking. These are game changers. These are the sorts of things that are going to create new frontiers in terms of the responsibility of the big four and the major lenders and their conduct generally. So I think we are in for a fairly prolonged period of correction, and the longer that period is and the greater the shocks, the more likely scenarios 3 and possibly even 4. And this, of course, is not allowing for any external factors, and that again is a whole area of uncertainty, particularly with what's happening at the trade level. So I think 2, if we're lucky, scenario 2. The direct answer to your question will relate back to your analysis, which I totally agree with. It's more likely 3 or 4, and I think in terms of when we'll get a fix, all else being equal, and I'm now straying into the realms of prediction, which we both hate doing, but I think that probably by the time these interest-only loans come up for renegotiation around about 2019, 2020, I think that will coincide with us having a better idea of what the lay of the land from a finance point of view is going to look like in the next decade. And I think that will be the end of a period of uncertainty. But I think we're in for quite a volatile ride and potential gyrations in prices, particularly at the higher end of things between now and then.
Chris, I really appreciate your time, and thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Bye.
There we go. So you've heard it from the horse's mouth, as it were. Property prices look as though they could be on their way down. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.